HMS Agamemnon was one of two Lord Nelson-class pre-dreadnought battleships launched in 1906 and completed in 1908. She was the Royal Navy's second-to-last pre-dreadnought battleship to be built, followed by her sister ship, Lord Nelson. She was assigned to the Channel Fleet when the First World War began in 1914. The ship was transferred to the Mediterranean Sea with Lord Nelson in early 1915 to participate in the Dardanelles campaign. She made a number of bombardments against Turkish fortifications and in support of British troops. Agamemnon remained in the Mediterranean after the conclusion of that campaign to prevent the German battlecruiser SMS Goeben and light cruiser Breslau from breaking out into the Mediterranean. Agamemnon shot down the German Zeppelin LZ-55, LZ-85, during a bombing mission over Salonika in 1916. On 30 October 1918, the Ottoman Empire signed the Armistice of Mudros on board the ship while she was anchored at Lemnos in the northern Aegean Sea. She was converted to a radio-controlled target ship following her return to the United Kingdom in March 1919 and began service in 1921. Agamemnon was the last pre-dreadnought in service with the Royal Navy. She was replaced by Centurion at the end of 1926 and sold for scrap in January 1927. Construction and description: HMS Agamemnon was ordered in 1904 and was the first warship built by the William Beardmore and Company's Dalmuir Naval Construction Works. She was laid down on the 15th of May, 1905, and launched on the 23rd of June, 1906, before the dockyards themselves were finished. Her completion was greatly delayed by labor troubles and by the diversion of the 12-inch, 305 mm, guns intended for her to expedite completion of Dreadnought. And she was not finally completed until June 1908, 6 months before her sister, Lord Nelson. Agamemnon displaced 17,683 long tons, 17,967 tons, at deep load as built, with a length of 443 feet 6 inches, 135.2 meters, a beam of 79 feet 6 inches, 24.2 meters, and a draft of 26 feet 9 inches, 8.2 meters. She was powered by two inverted vertical triple-expansion four-cylinder steam engines, which developed a total of 16,750 indicated horsepower, 12,490 kilowatts, and gave a maximum speed of 18 knots, 33 kilometers per hour, 21 miles per hour. The ship was armed with 4 BL 12-inch MKX guns arranged in two twin-gun turrets, one each fore and aft. Her secondary armament consisted of 10 BL 9.2-inch Mk11 guns in twin-gun turrets on each corner of the superstructure, and a single gun turret between them, plus 24 QF 12-pounder 18 CWT guns. She also mounted 5 submerged 18-inch, 457 mm, torpedo tubes, for which 23 torpedoes were stowed aboard. Agamemnon had an armor belt at her waterline that was 12 inches, 305 mm, thick, as were the faces and sides of her gun turrets. Pre-First World War HMS Agamemnon, commissioned on the 25th of June 1908 at Chatham Dockyard for service in the Nore Division of the Home Fleet. On the 11th of February, 1911, she grazed an uncharted rock in the harbor at Ferrol, Spain, and damaged her bottom. She was temporarily attached in September 1913 to the 4th Battle Squadron. 5. First World War. After the First World War began in August 1914, Agamemnon was assigned to the 5th Battle Squadron in the Channel Fleet and was based at Portland. With other ships, she covered the safe transport of the British Expeditionary Force under the command of Sir John French to France. On the 14th of November, she transferred to Sheerness to guard the English coast against the possibility of a German invasion. She returned to Portland on the 30th of December and was employed in the defense of the southern ports of England and patrols of the English Channel until February 1915. 4. Dardanelles Campaign, 1915–16. In February 1915, Agamemnon was ordered to participate in the Dardanelles Campaign. She departed Portland on the 9th of February and joined the British Dardanelles Squadron at Mudros 10 days later. That was the second day of the opening bombardment of the Ottoman Turkish forts guarding the entrance to the Dardanelles, and the ship immediately joined the attack. She also took part in the subsequent bombardment of the inner forts, later in February. Agamemnon was hit by 7 9.4-inch, 240mm shells in 10 minutes on 25 February and was holed above the waterline, suffering 3 dead. She supported the small amphibious landings of the 4th of March and participated in another bombardment on 6th of March 1915. She came under heavy fire from Fort Hamidi on 7 March, taking 8 hits from large-caliber shells. One of them, allegedly a 14-inch, 356mm round, blew a large hole in her quarterdeck and wrecked the wardroom and the gunroom. She also took several hits by light shells that day, and, although she suffered damage to her superstructure, her fighting and steaming capabilities were not seriously impaired. The ship also participated in the main attack on the Dardanelles forts on the 18th of March. This time, a 6-inch, 152mm howitzer battery opened fire on Agamemnon and hit her 12 times in 25 minutes. 5 of the howitzer shells hit her armor and did no damage, but the 7 that hit outside her armor protection did considerable structural damage and temporarily put one of her 12-inch, 305mm guns out of action. 4. On 25th of April, Agamemnon supported the main landings as part of the 5th Squadron, and after that she patrolled to protect Allied minesweeping and net-laying vessels operating in the Dardanelles. In action against Ottoman field batteries, she took 2 hits between 28th April and 30th April, and she provided fire support for Allied troops during a Turkish counterattack on the 1st of May. Agamemnon bombarded Ottoman artillery batteries on the 6th of May prior to the Second Battle of Krithia. Agamemnon was withdrawn to Malta later in May to undergo a refit and returned to the Dardanelles in June. On the 2nd of December, the ship joined the protected cruiser Endymion and monitor M33 in bombarding the Kavak Bridge, destroying several spans of it and interdicting Ottoman communications to the Gallipoli Peninsula. Mediterranean Operations, 1916–18. With the end of the Dardanelles Campaign in January 1916, British naval forces in the area were reorganized, and Agamemnon became part of the Eastern Mediterranean Squadron, which was renamed the Aegean Squadron in August 1917. Under both names, the squadron was dispersed throughout the area to protect Allied-held islands, support the British Army at Salonika, and guard against any attempted breakout from the Dardanelles by the German battlecruiser Goeben and light cruiser Breslau. Agamemnon spent the remainder of the war based at Salonika and Mudros, alternating between the 2 bases with her sister, Lord Nelson. Agamemnon was based mostly at Mudros, Lord Nelson mostly at Salonika. While carrying out these duties, Agamemnon damaged the Imperial German Navy, Zeppelin LZ-55, LZ-85, on 5 May 1916 at Salonika, with a shell from a 12-pounder and forced it to crash land. Of all the responsibilities given the 2 ships, the most important was to guard the Eastern Mediterranean against a breakout by Goeben. But when Goeben and Breslau finally made their breakout attempt on the 20th of January 1918, Lord Nelson was away at Salonika, and Agamemnon could not get steam up to depart Mudros in time to participate in the resulting Battle of Imbros. After both German ships struck mines, Breslau sank and Goeben returned to the Dardanelles before Agamemnon could arrive on the scene. Agamemnon underwent a refit at Malta in 1918. On 30 October, the Ottoman Empire signed the Armistice of Mudros on board Agamemnon, while she was anchored at Lemnos in the northern Aegean Sea. Agamemnon was part of the British squadron that went to Constantinople in November 1918 following the armistice. She returned to, based on the earlier experience in radio-controlled British drone weapons, Agamemnon was modified at Chatham Dockyard for use as a target ship between 6 December 1920 and 8 April 1921. The ship was rewired for radio control and stripped. The 12-inch turrets remained aboard, but all of her guns and their equipment were removed, as were her torpedo equipment, flying deck, sea cabins, main derrick and boat equipment, lower conning tower, masts and yards, most of her crew amenities, and other unnecessary equipment. Unnecessary hatches, coamings, scuttles, and lifts were removed and plated over, and she was ballasted differently than she had been as a battleship. It was not intended to sink her, so she was assigned a crew of 153 to maintain and operate her when she was not under fire. Agamemnon's first target service took place before her modifications were completed. On the 19th of March, 1921, she was exposed to a cloud of poisonous gas to determine the effect of gas on a battleship. It was found that gas could penetrate the ship via her various openings, but the ship had not been sealed against gas before the trial, and no accurate results applicable to a commissioned battleship could be obtained. On 21 September, she was subjected to machine gun fire by strafing aircraft. These trials showed that such strafing could harass a battleship, but could not impair her fighting or steaming capabilities, and help to determine protection for bridge personnel. Agamemnon also was used to test the vulnerability of battleships to 6-inch 152 mm, 5.5-inch 140 mm, and 4.7-inch 120 mm rounds fired at her by ships such as the battlecruisers Renown and Repulse, while she maneuvered under radio control. These tests showed that ships protected as well as Agamemnon, such as the later dreadnoughts, would suffer damage to their upper works if struck by such shells, but would not have their steaming or fighting capability seriously impaired even by numerous smaller-caliber hits. HMS Campbelltown was a Town-class destroyer of the Royal Navy, RN, during the Second World War. She was originally U.S. destroyer USS Buchanan, and was one of 50 obsolescent U.S. Navy destroyers transferred to the RN in 1940 as part of the Destroyers for Bases Agreement. 2. Between 17 January 1941 and 15 October 1941, she also briefly served in the Royal Netherlands Navy as HNLMS Campbelltown before being returned to the RAN. Campbelltown became one of the most famous of these ships when she was used in the St. Nazaire raid in 1942. As USS Buchanan was a Wickes-class destroyer, ordered from the Bath Iron Works, Bath, Maine, and laid down on 29 June 1918. She was launched on 2 January 1919 and commissioned into the Navy on 20 January. She had a typical interwar career and was placed into the reserve in 1939. She then became one of 50 destroyers transferred to the Royal Navy in 1940 after the finalization of the Destroyers for Bases Agreement. She was transferred on 3 September 1940 and commissioned on 9 September at Halifax, Canada. That very same day, Lieutenant Isaac William Trant Belleau became her captain. As HMS Campbelltown, having been formally commissioned, she took passage from Halifax to Plymouth, traveling via St. John's, Newfoundland. She arrived at Devonport Dockyard on the 29th of September and was taken in hand for modifications to fit her for service with the Royal Navy. The refits lasted throughout October, and on completion of the final harbor trials on the 1st of November 1940, she was nominated to join the 17th Flotilla, operating in the western approaches. The next day, while carrying out sea trials, she collided with SS Rissoy and sustained damage, but continued and arrived safely at Liverpool, where she underwent repairs from 7 to 24 November. She then joined the flotilla. On 29th November, she ran down and sank the British coaster Fiddown in the Mersey estuary. She began deploying with the flotilla in early December, but on 3 December she collided with SS Comus and had to put into port for repairs again. The repairs lasted until late March and involved the shortening of the fourth funnel. As HYOTP A Team 8HN LTLMEMS Campbelltown. While still being repaired, Campbelltown was transferred on the 12th of January 1941 to the Royal Netherlands Navy and commissioned on the 17th of January 1941 as HNLMS Campbelltown. 11. Lieutenant Isaac William Trant Below was replaced by Lieutenant William Harmsen. 12. The Dutch proposed to rename her Middelburg. 13. But this was not agreed, as it would have been contrary to the naming agreed with the U.S. Navy. On completion of her repairs, Campbelltown joined on the 6th of April, 1941, the 7th Escort Group, and had during this time Liverpool as her home port. 11. She underwent further repairs throughout June and resumed convoy defense with the group in July-August. She was then nominated to be returned to the Royal Navy in September, but remained with the 7th Escort Group. She spent September working up with her Royal Navy crew and was returned on the 15th of October, 1941, to the Royal Navy. That same month, she rejoined the group, where she covered convoys between Britain and West Africa. 15 September, she picked up the survivors of the Norwegian motor tanker Vinga, which had been damaged in an enemy air attack. 14. She carried out escort duties in November to December, before taking passage to Devonport to undergo repairs. The St. Nazaire Raid. The St. Nazaire Raid Campbelltown began the Devonport repairs in January. During this time, she was selected for a special operation and was withdrawn from regular service for modifications. She was to be used in Operation Chariot, a planned assault operation on the docks at Saint-Nazaire. In 1942, the German battleship Tirpitz, anchored at Trondheim in Norway, was considered to present a grave threat to Atlantic convoys. 15. Should Tirpitz enter the Atlantic, the Louis Joubert dry dock at Saint-Nazaire, which had originally been built for the liner SS Normandie, was a vital target. It was the only German-held dry dock on the European coast of the Atlantic that was large enough to service the battleship. 16-17. If this dry dock could be put out of action, any offensive sortie by Tirpitz into the Atlantic would be much more dangerous for the Kriegsmarine to carry out, making it less likely that they would risk deploying her. 18. Operation Chariot was a plan to ram an explosive-laden warship into the dock gates. Accompanying her would be 18 small boats carrying British commandos, 19 who would destroy the dock's pumping and winding machinery and other infrastructure. The troops would then be evacuated by the small boats before the explosives in the ship detonated. A particular difficulty was that the dock was located several miles up the estuary of the Loire River. As an obsolescent destroyer, Campbelltown was considered to be expendable and was selected to be the ram ship. She spent February undergoing modifications. These included removing her third and fourth funnels and having the remaining 2 funnels raked to simulate the structure and appearance of a German Raubvogel-class torpedo boat. A 12-pounder gun was installed forward, and 8 20mm (0.79-inch) Oerlikon anti-aircraft cannon were mounted on the upper deck. Some extra armor was provided to protect the bridge structure, and unnecessary stores and equipment were removed to lighten the destroyer. An explosive charge consisting of 24 Mark 7 depth charges, containing a total of 4.5 short tons, 4.1 metric tons, of Amitol high explosive 20, was fitted into steel tanks installed just behind the steel pillar that supported her most forward gun mount. The charges were to be detonated by multiple 8-hour time pencils connected together by cord techs, set before steaming out, and cemented in to prevent any interference with the detonation. 21. 20 Campbelltown steamed from Devonport to Falmouth, Cornwall on 25th March to join the other ships that would take part in the operation. The crew, which would be evacuated with the commandos, was reduced to 75 men, under the command of Lieutenant Commander Stephen Beatty. A flotilla of 21 vessels, Campbelltown, 16 Fairmile B motor launches, 1 motor torpedo boat, and a Fairmile C motor gun boat, acting as the troops' headquarters, left Falmouth at 1400 on 26 March 1942, escorted for most of the crossing to France by 2 Hunt-class escort destroyers, 16 HMS Tyndale, 23, 19, and HMS Atherstone, 24. 19. Apart from a brief clash with German submarine U-593, whose captain misreported the task force's course and composition, 1923, the ships reached France unmolested. 1 motor launch suffered mechanical problems and had to return to England. The preliminary air raid carried out through heavy cloud by 35 Armstrong Whitworth Whitleys and 25 Vickers Wellingtons was much smaller than originally planned and was ineffective, merely alerting the defenders of something unusual happening. Nevertheless, by flashing genuine German recognition signals, the force, with Campbelltown flying the flag of the Kriegsmarine, approached to within less than 1 mile, 1.6 kilometers, of the harbor before being fired upon. Campbelltown, as the largest target, drew most of the fire. During the final approach, the crew of Campbelltown lowered the emblem of the Kriegsmarine and hoisted the battle ensign of the Royal Navy. 2019, at 01:34 on 28 March, 4 minutes later than planned, Campbelltown rammed the dock gate. The commandos and ship's crew came ashore under heavy German fire and set about demolishing the dock machinery. 169 of the raiders were killed, 64 commandos, and 105 sailors, out of the 611 men in the attacking force. Of the survivors, 215 were captured, and 222 were evacuated by the surviving small craft. A further 5 evaded capture and traveled overland through France to Spain and then to Gibraltar, a British territory. The charges in Campbelltown exploded at noon, an hour and a half later than the British had expected. Although the ship had been searched by the Germans, the explosives had not been detected. The explosion killed around 250 German soldiers and French civilians and demolished both the front half of the destroyer and the 160 short tons, 150 T caisson of the dry dock, with the rush of water into the dry dock washing the remains of the ship into it. The Saint-Nazaire dry dock was rendered unusable for the rest of the war and was not repaired until 1947, and only resumed normal service in 1947-1948. 27. The delayed action torpedoes fired by the motor torpedo boat into the outer lock gate to the submarine basin detonated as planned on the night of 30 March. This later explosion led to panic, with German forces firing on French civilians and on each other. 28 French civilians were killed and around 30 wounded. Later, 1,500 civilians were arrested and interned in a camp at Savigny, and most of their houses were demolished, even though they had had nothing to do with the raid. Beatty, who was taken prisoner, received the Victoria Cross for his valor, and in 1947 received the French Légion d'honneur. 30. His Victoria Cross was one of 5 awarded to participants in the raid, along with 80 other military decorations. The Battle of the Atlantic, the longest continuous military campaign, 11-12 in World War II, ran from 1939 to the defeat of Nazi Germany in 1945, covering a major part of the naval history of World War II. At its core was the Allied naval blockade of Germany, announced the day after the declaration of war, and Germany's subsequent counter-blockade. The campaign peaked from mid-1940 to the end of 1943. The Battle of the Atlantic pitted U-boats and other warships of the German Kriegsmarine, Navy, and aircraft of the Luftwaffe, Air Force, against the Royal Navy, Royal Canadian Navy, United States Navy, and Allied merchant shipping. Convoys, coming mainly from North America and predominantly going to the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union, were protected for the most part by the British and Canadian navies and air forces. These forces were aided by ships and aircraft of the United States beginning on September 13, 1941. The Germans were joined by submarines of the Italian Regia Marina, Royal Navy, after Germany's Axis ally Italy entered the war on the 10th of June, 1940. As an island country, the United Kingdom was highly dependent on imported goods. Britain required more than 1 million tons of imported material per week in order to survive and fight. The Battle of the Atlantic involved a tonnage war. The Allies struggled to supply Britain, while the Axis targeted merchant shipping critical to the British war effort. Rationing in the United Kingdom was also used with the aim of reducing demand, by reducing wastage and increasing domestic production and equality of distribution. From 1942 onwards, the Axis also sought to prevent the buildup of Allied supplies and equipment in the UK in preparation for the invasion of occupied Europe. The defeat of the U-boat threat was a prerequisite for pushing back the Axis in Western Europe. The outcome of the battle was a strategic victory for the Allies. The German tonnage war failed, but at great cost. 3,500 merchant ships and 175 warships were sunk in the Atlantic for the loss of 783 U-boats and 47 German surface warships, including 4 battleships, Bismarck, Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, and Tirpitz, 9 cruisers, 7 raiders, and 27 destroyers. This front was a main consumer of the German war effort. Germany spent more money to produce naval vessels than every type of ground vehicle combined, including tanks. 14. The Battle of the Atlantic has been called the longest, largest, and most complex naval battle in history. 15. Starting immediately after the European War began, during the Phoney War, the battle lasted over 5 years before the German surrender in May 1945. It involved thousands of ships in a theater covering millions of square miles of ocean. The situation changed constantly, with one side or the other gaining advantage, as participating countries surrendered, joined, and even changed sides in the war, and as new weapons, tactics, countermeasures, and equipment were developed. The Allies gradually gained the upper hand, overcoming German surface raiders by the end of 1942 and defeating the U-boats by mid-1943, though losses due to U-boats continued until the war's end. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill later wrote, "The only thing that really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril. I was even more anxious about this battle than I had been about the glorious air fight called The Battle of Britain. 16. Name on 5th March, 1941, the First Lord of the Admiralty, A.V. Alexander, asked Parliament for many more ships and great numbers of men to fight the Battle of the Atlantic, which he compared to the Battle of France fought the previous summer. 17. The first meeting of the Cabinet's Battle of the Atlantic Committee was on 19th March, 18. Churchill claimed to have coined the phrase Battle of the Atlantic shortly before Alexander's speech. 19. But there are several examples of earlier usage. Background. Following the use of unrestricted submarine warfare by Germany in the First World War, countries tried to limit or abolish submarines. The effort failed. Instead, the London Naval Treaty required submarines to abide by cruiser rules, which demanded they surface, search, and place ship crews in a place of safety, for which lifeboats did not qualify, except under particular circumstances. 23 before sinking them, unless the ship in question showed persistent refusal to stop or active resistance to visit or search. 24. These regulations did not prohibit arming merchantmen, 25, but doing so or having them report contact with submarines or raiders made them de facto naval auxiliaries and removed the protection of the cruiser rules. 26. The Treaty of Versailles forbade the Germans to operate U-boats and reduced the German surface fleet to a few obsolete ships. When 3 of these obsolete ships had to be replaced, the Germans opted to construct the Deutschland class of Panzerschiffe, armored ships, or pocket battleships, as they were nicknamed by foreign navies. These ships were designed for commerce raiding on distant seas, to operate as a raider hunting for independently sailing ships, and to avoid combat with superior forces. 27. Failed verification. The Anglo-German Naval Agreement of 1935 allowed Hitler to renounce the Treaty of Versailles and to build a fleet 35% the size of Britain's. A building program for 4 battleships, 2 aircraft carriers, 5 heavy cruisers, destroyers, and U-boats was immediately initiated. After the agreement, Hitler thought conflict with the UK very unlikely. Consequently, the fleet was designed for commerce raiding against the French, not to challenge command of the sea. 28-29. The commander of the German U-boats, Karl Dönitz, had his own opinions. In contrast with Hitler and Erich Raeder, chief of the German Navy, he considered war with the UK inevitable, and that a large surface fleet was not needed, believing U-boats could defeat the British. According to his calculations, a fleet of 300 medium Type 7 U-boats could sink 1 million tons of ships a month, and within a year sink enough of the about 3,000 British merchant ships, comprising 17.5 million tons, to strangle the British economy. 30-31. 32. In the First World War, U-boats had been defeated mainly by the convoy system, but Dönitz thought this could be overcome with the Rudel tactic, wherein a patrol line of U-boats would search for a convoy before converging and attacking together at night from the surface. 33. Neither aircraft nor early forms of sonar, called ASDIC by the British, were then considered serious threats. ASDIC could not detect a surfaced submarine, and its range was less than that of an electric torpedo. Aircraft could not operate at night, and, during the day, an alert U-boat could dive before the aircraft attacked. 34. Failed verification. Dönitz failed to persuade Raeder, so each time the U-boat fleet was expanded, Raeder opted to build a mix of coastal, medium, and large submarines, even mine layers and U-cruisers. Even when in 1938, Hitler realized he would sooner or later have to oppose the UK and launched his Plan Z. Only a minority of the planned 239 U-boats were medium U-boats. 35. Anti-submarine warfare. With the introduction of ASDIC, the British Admiralty believed the submarine threat effectively neutralized. Consequently, the number of destroyers and convoy escorts was reduced, and the anti-submarine branch seen as third-rate. Destroyers were also equipped with ASDIC, but it was expected that these ships would be used in fleet actions rather than anti-submarine warfare, so they were not extensively trained in their use. Trials with ASDIC were usually conducted in ideal conditions, and the Admiralty failed to appreciate ASDIC's flaws. Its range was limited, worked poorly at speeds above 8 knots, was hampered by rough weather, and required a very skilled operator to distinguish echoes from thermoclines, whales, shoals of fish, and wrecks. 36. Early versions could not look directly down, so contact would be lost during the final stages of a depth charge attack. The basic set could detect range and bearing, but target depth could only be estimated from the range at which contact was lost. An escort swept its ASDIC beam in an arc from one side of its course to the other, stopping the transducer every few degrees to send out a signal. On detection of a submarine, the escort would close in at moderate speed and increase its speed to attack. The intention was to pass over the submarine, rolling depth charges from chutes at the stern, while throwers fired further charges to either side, laying a pattern of depth charges. To disable a submarine, a depth charge had to explode within about 20 feet, 6.1 meters. Since early ASDIC equipment was poor at determining depth, it was usual to vary the depth settings on part of the pattern. As the threat of war loomed in early 1939, Britain realized it could not rely on the London Naval Treaty, which outlawed unrestricted submarine warfare. 38. The organizational infrastructure for convoys had been maintained since World War I, with a thorough and systematic upgrade in the second half of the 1930s, 39, but not enough escorts were available for convoy escorting, and a crash program for building Tree-class trawlers, Flower-class corvettes, and Hunt-class destroyers was initiated. 36 merchant ships that were either too fast or too slow for convoys were to be equipped with a self-defense gun against surfaced submarine attacks, thus forcing an attacking U-boat to spend its precious torpedoes. This removed these ships from the protection of the cruiser rules under the prize law. 38. Despite this lack of readiness, in 1939, the Royal Navy probably had as many ASDIC-equipped warships in service as all the other navies of the world combined. 40. Similarly, the role of aircraft had been neglected. The Royal Air Force had organized a coastal command to support the Royal Navy, but it possessed insufficient aircraft, had no long-range aircraft, nor were aircraft crew trained in anti-submarine warfare. The only weapon against submarines was inadequate bombs. 41. 42. Finally, it was not forgotten that in World War I, mines had sunk more U-boats than any other weapon. Plans were drafted for minefields in the Channel and along the East Coast in defense of shipping lanes, and also offensive mine barrages on the German U-boat lanes towards the Atlantic Ocean. 43. Early skirmishes, September 1939, May 1940. In 1939, the Kriegsmarine lacked the strength to challenge the combined British Royal Navy and French Navy Marine Nationale for command of the sea. Instead, German naval strategy relied on commerce raiding using capital ships, armed merchant cruisers, submarines, and aircraft. Many German warships were already at sea when war was declared in September 1939, including most of the available U-boats and the pocket battleships Deutschland and Admiral Graf Spee, which had sortied into the Atlantic in August. These ships immediately attacked British and French shipping. U-30 sank the ocean liner SS Athenia, within hours of the declaration of war, in breach of her orders not to sink passenger ships. The U-boat fleet, which was to dominate so much of the Battle of the Atlantic, was small at the beginning of the war. Many of the 57 available U-boats were the small and short-range Type 2s, useful primarily for mine-laying and operations in British coastal waters. Much of the early German anti-shipping activity involved mine-laying by destroyers, aircraft, and U-boats off British ports. With the outbreak of war, the British and French immediately began a blockade of Germany, with little immediate effect on German industry. The Royal Navy quickly introduced a convoy system for the protection of trade that gradually extended out from the British Isles, eventually reaching as far as Panama, Bombay, and Singapore. Convoys allowed the Royal Navy to concentrate its escorts near the one place the U-boats were guaranteed to be found: the convoys. Each convoy consisted of between 30 and 70 mostly unarmed merchant ships. Some British naval officials, particularly the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, sought a more offensive strategy. The Royal Navy formed anti-submarine hunting groups based on aircraft carriers to patrol the shipping lanes in the western approaches and hunt for German U-boats. This strategy was deeply flawed because a U-boat, with its tiny silhouette, was likely to spot the surface warships and submerge long before it was sighted. The carrier aircraft were little help. Although they could spot submarines on the surface, at this stage of the war they had no adequate weapons to attack them, and any submarine found by an aircraft was long gone by the time surface warships arrived. The hunting group strategy proved a disaster within days. On the 14th of September 1939, Britain's most modern carrier, HMS Ark Royal, narrowly avoided being sunk when 3 torpedoes from U-39 exploded prematurely. U-39 was forced to surface and scuttle by the escorting destroyers, becoming the first U-boat loss of the war. Another carrier, HMS Courageous, was sunk 3 days later by U-29. German success in sinking Courageous was surpassed a month later when Gunther Prien in U-47 penetrated the British base at Scapa Flow and sank the old battleship HMS Royal Oak at anchor, immediately becoming a hero in Germany. In the South Atlantic, British forces were stretched by the cruise of Admiral Graf Spee, which sank 9 merchant ships of 50,000 gross register tons, GRT, in the South Atlantic and Indian Ocean during the first 3 months of war. The British and French formed hunting groups including 3 battlecruisers, 3 aircraft carriers, and 15 cruisers to seek the raider and her sister Deutschland, which was operating in the North Atlantic. These hunting groups had no success until Admiral Graf Spee was caught off the mouth of the River Plate between Argentina and Uruguay by an inferior British force. After suffering damage in the subsequent action, she took shelter in neutral Montevideo harbor and was scuttled on the 17th of December, 1939. After this initial burst of activity, the Atlantic campaign quietened. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, had planned a maximum submarine effort for the first month of the war, with almost all the available U-boats out on patrol in September. That level of deployment could not be sustained. The boats needed to return to harbor to refuel, rearm, restock supplies, and refit. The harsh winter of 1939–40 froze many of the Baltic ports, seriously hampering the German offensive by trapping several new U-boats in the ice. Hitler's plans to invade Norway and Denmark in early 1940 led to the withdrawal of the fleet's surface warships and most of the ocean-going U-boats for fleet operations in Operation Weserübung. The resulting Norwegian campaign revealed serious flaws in the German U-boat torpedoes. Both the impact pistol and the magnetic influence pistol, detonation mechanism, were defective, and the torpedoes did not run at the proper depth, often undershooting targets. Only one British warship was sunk by U-boats in more than 38 attacks. The news spread through the U-boat fleet and undermined morale. 44. Since the effectiveness of the magnetic pistol was already reduced by the degaussing of Allied ships, Dönitz decided to use new contact pistols copied from British torpedoes found in the captured submarine HMS Seal. 45. The depth-setting mechanism was improved, but only in January 1942 were the last complications with that mechanism discovered and fixed, making the torpedo more reliable. 46-47. Completion of Hitler's campaign in Western Europe meant U-boats withdrawn from the Atlantic for the Norwegian campaign could return to the war on trade. Therefore, the number of U-boats in the Atlantic began to rise, while the availability of convoy escorts greatly decreased. 50. The only consolation for the British was that the large merchant fleets of occupied countries like Norway and the Netherlands came under British control. After the German occupation of Denmark and Norway, Britain occupied Iceland and the Faroe Islands, establishing bases and preventing a German takeover. It was in these circumstances that Winston Churchill, who had become Prime Minister on the 10th of May 1940, first wrote to President Franklin Roosevelt to request the loan of 50 obsolescent U.S. Navy destroyers. This led to the Destroyers for Bases Agreement, effectively a sale portrayed as a loan for political reasons, which operated in exchange for 99-year leases on certain British bases in Newfoundland, Bermuda, and the West Indies. This was a profitable bargain for the United States and militarily beneficial for Britain, freeing up British military assets to return to Europe. A significant percentage of the U.S. population opposed entering the war, and some American politicians, including the U.S. Ambassador to Britain Joseph P. Kennedy, believed Britain and its allies might lose. The first of these destroyers were only taken over by their British and Canadian crews in September, and all needed to be rearmed and fitted with ASDIC. It was many months before these ships contributed to the campaign. The happy time, June 1940, February 1941. The early U-boat operations from the French bases were spectacularly successful. This was the heyday of the great U-boat aces like Günther Prien of U-47, Otto Kretschmer, U-99, Joachim Schepke, U-100, Engelbert Endras, U-46, Victor Ern, U-37, and Heinrich Bleichroth, U-48. U-boat crews became heroes in Germany. From June until October 1940, over 270 Allied ships were sunk. This period was referred to by U-boat crews as the happy time, die glückliche Zeit. 51. Churchill would later write, "The only thing that ever frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." 52. The biggest challenge for U-boats was to find the convoys in the vastness of the ocean. The Germans had a handful of very long-range Focke-Wulf FW-200 Condor aircraft based at Bordeaux and Stavanger, which were used for reconnaissance. The Condor was a converted civilian airliner, a stopgap solution for Fliegerführer Atlantic. Due to ongoing friction between the Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine, the primary source of convoy sightings was the U-boats themselves. Since a submarine's bridge was very close to the water, their range of visual detection was short. The best source proved to be the codebreakers of B-Dienst, who had succeeded in deciphering the British naval cipher number 3, allowing the Germans to estimate where and when convoys could be expected. In response, the British applied the techniques of operations research and developed some counterintuitive solutions for protecting convoys. Realizing the area of a convoy increased by the square of its perimeter, they determined that the same number of ships and escorts would be better protected in a single convoy than two. A large convoy was as difficult to locate as a small one. Reduced frequency also reduced the chances of detection, as fewer large convoys could carry the same amount of cargo, while large convoys take longer to assemble. Therefore, a few large convoys with apparently few escorts were safer than many small convoys with a higher ratio of escorts to merchantmen. Instead of attacking the Allied convoys singly, U-boats were directed to work in wolf packs, roudel, coordinated by radio. The boats spread out into a long patrol line that bisected the path of the Allied convoy routes. Once in position, the crew studied the horizon through binoculars looking for masts or smoke, or used hydrophones to pick up propeller noises. When one boat sighted a convoy, it would report the sighting to U-boat headquarters, shadowing and continuing to report as needed until other boats arrived, typically at night. Instead of being faced by single submarines, the convoy escorts then had to cope with groups of up to half a dozen U-boats attacking simultaneously. The most daring commanders, such as Kretschmer, penetrated the escort screen and attacked from within the columns of merchantmen. 53. The escort vessels, which were too few in number and often lacking in endurance, had no answer to multiple submarines attacking on the surface at night, as their ASDIC worked well only against underwater targets. 54. Early British Marine radar, working in the metric bands, lacked target discrimination and range. Corvettes were too slow to catch a surfaced U-boat. Pack tactics were first used successfully in September and October 1940 to devastating effect, in a series of convoy battles. On 21 September, convoy HX-72 of 42 merchantmen was attacked by a pack of 4 U-boats, which sank 11 ships and damaged 2 over the course of 2 nights. In October, the slow convoy SC-7, with an escort of 2 sloops and 2 corvettes, was overwhelmed, losing 59% of its ships. The battle for HX-79 in the following days was in many ways worse for the escorts than for SC-7. The loss of a quarter of the convoy without any loss to the U-boats, despite a very strong escort, 2 destroyers, 4 corvettes, 3 trawlers, and a minesweeper, demonstrated the effectiveness of the German tactics against the inadequate British anti-submarine methods. On the 1st of December, 7 German and 3 Italian submarines caught HX-90, sinking 10 ships and damaging 3 others. At the end of 1940, the Admiralty viewed the number of ships sunk with growing alarm. Damaged ships might survive, but could be out of commission for long periods. 2 million gross tons of merchant shipping, 13% of the fleet available to the British, were under repair and unavailable, which had the same effect in slowing down cross-Atlantic supplies. 55. Nor were the U-boats the only threat. Following some early experience in support of the war at sea during Operation Weserübung, the Luftwaffe began to take a toll of merchant ships. Martin Harlinghausen and his recently established command, Fliegerführer Atlantic, contributed small numbers of aircraft to the Battle of the Atlantic from 1941 onwards. These were primarily FW-200 Condors. The Condors also bombed convoys that were beyond land-based fighter cover and thus defenseless. Initially, the Condors were very successful, claiming 365,000 tons of shipping in early 1941. These aircraft were few in number and directly under Luftwaffe control. The pilots had little specialized training for anti-shipping warfare, limiting their effectiveness. Coming soon next part. Thanks for watching. Subscribe now.